Our reading this morning is taken from the pen of Sarah Moores Campbell, one of our ministers who's retired, and I will read it alone and you can follow it. In the tomb of the soul, we carry secret yearnings, pains, fears, worries, and regrets. In the tomb of the soul, we take refuge from the world and its heaviness. In the tomb of the soul, we wrap ourselves in the security of darkness. Sometimes it prepares us for experience. Sometimes it insulates us from life. Sometimes it gives us time to feel pain of the world and reach out to others. Sometimes it numbs us and locks us up within our own concerns. In this season, where light and dark balance the day, we seek balance for ourselves. Grateful for the darkness that has nurtured us, we push away the stone and invite the light to awaken us to the possibilities within and among us for new life. On this Easter Sunday, when Christians are celebrating the enduring significance of Jesus' life, I want to examine the phenomenon of hero worship. I will consider the practice first at the personal level, then as a cultural activity, and finally as a description of religion, particularly Christianity. Hero worship as a personal experience is something with which we are all familiar. Every one of us can remember someone whom we once admired to the point of idolization, who at that time embodied our highest ideals. And the first thing to note about such experience is that it represented a coming together of two factors: our psychological need for such a figure and the availability of a person to fulfill that need. The second thing I would say about such hero worship is that it can be healthy, even when the hero or heroine is limited, if and when such admiration inspires personal growth in the worshiper. Ralph Waldo Emerson, our patron saint, once wrote that our greatest need is for someone who will make us want to be what we can be. Our greatest need is to find someone who will make us want to be what we can be. I think that's true. We all need people who will motivate us toward the fulfillment of our unique potential as persons. Thus, even though the person being idolized by a young boy or girl may not be an appropriate model for an adult, the experience could be beneficial if it led that young person toward the next stage of his or her development. A few years ago, I visited my high school football coach in Detroit, a man that I had deeply idolized in those days. And I painfully discovered that we had little in common anymore. Besides his still being a devout Roman Catholic and a political conservative, he had remained a fanatic about sports, which, contrary to my wife's opinion, I no longer am. But at one time, that man was crucially important as a hero in my life, motivating me to stay in school and strive for a larger fulfillment of my existence. He even talked me out of being a phys ed major to take a more serious biological major. Even limited heroes can be importantly valuable, is what I'm saying. Finally, I would suggest that hero worship can be unhealthy if the psychological need of the subject is greater than the character of the person chosen to fulfill it. This can manifest itself in two ways. The first is that the need is so great that it attaches to unworthy persons. For example, in admiration of the so-called strength of a deeply flawed but charismatic character. The best illustration of such perversion were the Manson family's idolization of that demented figure and the tragic devotion of the followers of Jim Jones, who were literally led to their deaths in Guyana. But the more common and subtle perversion of hero worship occurs when the greatness of our psychological need inclines us to project perfection upon the imperfect persons, who are therefore incapable of carrying that burden. Sometimes the objects themselves encourage such adulation. One of my literature professors said that the difference between Ben Jonson and William Shakespeare was that Jonson takes you to the window of truth and then stands in front of it. More often, it is the subject's need for an infallible hero which is operative. But the result is the same. Instead of being an agent of growth, the hero or heroine becomes the occasion of psychological stunting, because the presumed perfection of that hero or heroine limits the development of what is uniquely individual in us. In summary, hero worship is healthy when it inspires growth. Therefore, we should either pick persons who are themselves growing or be prepared to change our heroes and heroines periodically, which is what most of us do. We move on to the next hero or heroine. Now let's turn to an examination of hero worship as a cultural phenomenon, which is universally experienced in every age and every nation. Once again, we see that it represents a coming together of a people's psychological need and a person capable of fulfilling that need at that time. There is dispute regarding whether history makes heroes or heroines and heroines make history. One observer wrote, "There are no great human beings, only great challenges which ordinary people rise to meet." There's some truth in that, but Thomas Carlyle insisted that all history is the history of great persons. There's truth in both of these contentions. As Shakespeare wrote, "Some achieve greatness, others have greatness thrust upon them." And the fact is that troubled times demand and often produce heroic leadership. But those who rise as leaders will be those particularly capable of meeting that challenge. Whether history is the cause or the effect, however, the reality is that hero worship is a common, crucial factor in the life and destiny of nations. Again, we must recognize that this can be a healthy thing, even when the hero or heroine is of limited stature, if he or she inspires the growth of that culture at that time. As is true of a young person, someone may be, if only temporarily, an appropriate hero for a nation, whereas at another time be incapable of that function. The most obvious example is the experience of Winston Churchill, who was probably the best person to lead Britain during World War II, when his dramatic eloquence inspired great determination and courage during that nation's darkest hour. But as a peacetime prime minister, Churchill failed miserably and was voted out of office. The history of hero worship as a cultural phenomenon is that exalted figures come and go as the needs of nations change, and that is healthy. Nations, like individuals, need different heroes and heroines as circumstances change. But the inescapable fact of history is that hero worship can be a destructive activity when demagogues rise up to fill the vacuum of a leaderless society. The most obvious illustration, of course, of a nation's psychological needs being greater than the available heroes was seen in Nazi Germany's idolization of Adolf Hitler. It's hard to believe that this demonic figure was worshipped by so many. But in 1940, when a 20-year-old German pilot was shot down over London, his last words were a request for a picture of Hitler which he could gaze upon as he died. Again, however, the more common perversion of hero worship occurs when an admirable but all too human figure is ascribed superhuman perfection and is corrupted by such veneration. As someone once wrote, "Power tends to corrupt, and few leaders are able to resist such a temptation to tyranny. Most will begin to believe that they have a divinely appointed role to play. Napoleonic complex is the name given to such an affliction derived from one hero who suffered from it. This deification of the hero is sometimes visited upon the persons after their deaths, as is suggested in one of my favorite quotes: "The retribution which history visits upon its great figures is to give them followers." And of course the followers then make the hero's views a matter of sacred dogma. But such rigidity of belief, I call it hardening of the categories, discourages further development and thus becomes an agent of decay rather than growth for those who maintain such abject adulation. Hero worship then as a social phenomenon is often a healthy thing, but when the hero or heroine is deified, the result is inescapably destructive of human welfare. Which leads us to an examination of religion as hero worship. All religions are built around the lives of and teachings of heroic figures. Taoism venerates the writings of the ancient Chinese sage Lao Tzu. Buddhism enshrines the example and wisdom of Gautama. Judaism reveres the name of Moses. Islam recites the Quran and worships its transmitter, Muhammad. And of course, Christianity is based on the teachings and the revered person of Jesus. In every instance, however, the religious leaders themselves sought to discourage, in every one of those cases, the religious leaders sought to discourage any attempt to deify them or attribute divine infallibility to their works. That, again, was the retribution visited upon them by their followers. Gautama's advice to his followers was, "Be ye lamps unto yourselves. Don't always count on me." Or as Sheldon Kopp, the psychologist, once put it more recently in a book, "If you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him." What he meant was, lest your own understanding of the truth be limited by the encounter. And Moses saw himself as unworthy to be even a spokesman for God. As a good Jew, he would regard the deification of any human being as downright blasphemous. Jesus would have shared that view. Indeed, he is quoted in the oldest gospel, that of Mark, as responding to someone's addressing him as "good master" by saying, "Don't call me good, only God is good." But later, when the Gospel of Matthew was written, the statement was changed. It read, "Don't ask me about the good," as his followers began to ascribe divinity to Jesus. On the time remaining, I would focus on the hero worship of Jesus by Christianity. And the first thing to note is that it is an example of a culture's psychological need being fulfilled by a person who, in the scriptural words, quote, "came in the fullness of time." The second thing I would say is that Jesus did have a very healthy influence on his followers, helping them to live more courageously and caringly because of his influence. His simple message, which touched their lives, was this: the kingdom of heaven is within you, and it is realized not by pious religiosity, but by the maintenance of your moral integrity and your sensitivity of spirit. Just before he died, responding to their devotion to him, Jesus put it this way: "If you say, if you love me, then feed the hungry, clothe the naked, heal the sick," and so forth. "For as much as you do it unto the least of these, you do it unto me." And for centuries, millions of followers have heeded that call to minister to the needy of the world, founding hospitals and schools, feeding the poor and serving humanity in his name, and making the hero worship of Jesus a healthy thing. But there also have been those, of course, whose own psychological need led to a perversion of this regard for Jesus. They replaced the profound ethical teachings of the Galilean with a set of doctrinal beliefs about him, claiming for Jesus a divine identity which he never would have claimed for himself. To the question, what shall I do to be saved? Because Jesus had answered, you must love God and man. That's it. But they gave a doctrinal answer. To be saved, you got to believe that Jesus is your Savior and Lord, that he is the Son of God. No moral requirements, just accept the dogma and you will be saved. This wasn't simply a perversion of hero worship, it was a betrayal of the teachings of Jesus, who said, not those who cry, Lord, Lord, but those who do the will of God shall know salvation. And what is that will? That you love your neighbor as yourself. Dorothy Sayers, the writer, once observed, not Herod, nor Pilate, not even Judas ever contrived to fasten upon Jesus the reproach of blandness. That indignity was left for pious hands to inflict. To make of his story something that could neither startle nor inspire a living soul is to crucify the Son of Man afresh and put him to open shame. End of quote. Well, that is true. Jesus was no pious sentimentalist, peddling theological cliches to a world of suffering and injustice. If he had confined himself to such Mickey Mouse morality, we never would have heard of him. Jesus was crucified because he spoke up for the poor and challenged the immoralities of his time. And it is that champion of human justice whose spirit should be remembered this day with a renewed commitment to his courageous caring. That is the hero worship that commends itself even to Unitarian Universalists. It promises an immortality which is available to every one of us and is, I think, the only eternity worth having.